The date on the package is a guideline, not a verdict. Plenty of food is still perfectly fine well past a best by date, and some food goes bad early even sitting right next to its date, unopened, in a fridge that's working fine. Your senses are usually a better test than the label. Today we're going through 10 real signs that food has actually turned, the ones worth trusting over a printed date, and one thing at the very end that every one of these signs still can't tell you. We're counting down from 10 to number 1. And number 1 is the one piece of information in this entire video that genuinely matters more than anything else on the list. Quick note before we start. Most of this is about quality signs, not danger signs, and that distinction actually matters. A lot of spoiled food just tastes bad. A much smaller amount of contaminated food can make you seriously sick, and those two categories don't always overlap the way people assume. We'll cover the same 3 things for every sign on this list: what's actually causing it, what it means throw the whole thing out versus just trim the affected part, and how to tell it apart from something that just looks a little off but is genuinely fine. One more thing worth saying up front. Dates printed on packages come in a few different flavors: sell by, use by, best by, and none of them are federally standardized safety cutoffs in the US the way people assume. That's exactly why the signs on this list matter more than the number. Let's get into it. Smell is usually the fastest test there is, and it's a genuinely good one. Bacteria and yeast produce their own byproducts as they break food down, and a lot of those byproducts smell distinctly sour, sharp, or just wrong in a way that's hard to describe but easy to recognize. Milk gone sour is the classic example almost everyone already knows. That sharp, tangy smell isn't subtle, and it shows up well before the milk actually looks any different in the carton. Raw meat and poultry are worth an extra B of caution here. A sour or distinctly off smell means bacteria have already been multiplying, and that's true even if the color and texture still look completely normal. The trick is knowing a food's normal smell in the first place. Some cheeses and fermented foods are supposed to smell strong. So the useful comparison isn't does this smell strange, it's does this smell different from how it normally smells. Fish is worth its own mention here. Fresh fish should smell like the ocean or barely anything at all, not fishy in the strong sense people expect. A genuinely fishy, ammonia-tinged smell is actually the spoilage sign, which surprises people who assume that smell is just what fish smells like. Eggs have their own version of this test too, and it's oddly satisfying once you know it. Crack a questionable egg into a separate bowl before adding it to anything else, since a rotten egg has an unmistakable sulfur smell the moment it hits air, well before it touches the rest of the meal. Mold shows up as fuzzy patches, usually green, white, or blue-gray, and it's one of the most obvious signs on this entire list. The part people get wrong is what to do once they actually spot it. 4 hard foods, like a block of cheese or a firm vegetable, cutting well around a small mold spot, and eating the rest is genuinely fine in a lot of cases, because mold has a harder time spreading through dense material. Soft, high-moisture foods are the opposite story. Bread, soft cheese, yogurt, anything with a texture mold can spread through easily. The whole thing goes, not just the visible spot, since mold's roots reach further into soft food than the surface patch suggests. When in doubt with anything soft, the visible mold is genuinely just the part you can see. Treat it as evidence the rest is already affected too, not as an isolated problem you can cut around. Strawberries and other berries are one of the worst offenders here, since mold spreads through a container fast once one berry starts. It's worth checking every single berry the moment mold shows up on any of them, not just pulling the obviously bad one. Nuts and grains carry a specific extra risk worth knowing. Mold on those can produce aflatoxins, a genuinely dangerous byproduct that doesn't disappear even if the mold itself gets removed. Unlike bread or cheese, this is a category where any visible mold means the whole batch goes, no cutting around it. Slime is one of the more reliable signs on this list, and it's specifically a bacterial signal. That sticky film forming on the surface of deli meat, chicken, or fish is a byproduct of bacteria actively growing, not just the food sitting out. Leafy greens do a version of this too, though it looks a little different. Slimy, darkened patches on lettuce or spinach are enzymatic breakdown combined with bacterial growth, and it spreads through a bag fast once it starts. A quick touch test is worth doing before cooking anything that's been sitting a few days. If it feels tacky or slick in a way fresh versions of the same food never do. That's the texture talking, and it's usually right. Worth knowing, rinsing slimy meat or produce doesn't fix this. The slime is a surface symptom of something already happening throughout the food, not a coating that washes away. Fresh raw chicken does have a naturally slightly tacky, moist surface, which is worth knowing so it doesn't get confused with actual spoilage slime. The real version is noticeably stickier, almost gluey, and usually shows up alongside a smell change too. Shrimp and other shellfish spoil fast once opened, faster than most other proteins in the fridge. A slick, slippery film on shrimp that wasn't there when the package was fresh is one of the quickest appearing signs on this entire list, sometimes within a single day. Meat turning from bright red to a dull gray-brown is often just oxidation, exposure to air, and on its own it's not automatically a spoilage sign. Color change becomes meaningful when it shows up together with slime or an off smell, not by itself. A genuine greenish or overly dark tint, especially with any shimmer or iridescence to it, is a different story entirely. That combination usually means bacterial growth has been underway for a while. Cut fruit browning is worth a separate mention because it confuses people constantly. That's an enzyme reacting with air, the exact same thing that happens to a cut apple in 5 minutes. It's a cosmetic change, not a spoilage sign on its own. The real test is always the combination. Color change plus smell plus texture is a genuine signal. Color change completely alone, especially on something freshly cut, usually isn't telling you much at all. Vacuum-sealed meat sometimes looks a darker purplish red than what's sitting in an open case, purely because it's not exposed to oxygen inside the package. That color shifts to the familiar bright red within minutes of opening it, which is normal, not a warning sign. Herbs and leafy greens yellowing is a similar kind of natural aging color shift, distinct from the darker, wetter discoloration that actually signals bacteria. Yellowing alone usually just means less flavor, not a food safety concern. Akin that's swollen, bulging, or leaking is one of the more serious signs on this entire list, and it deserves to be treated that way. Gas-producing bacteria inside a sealed container are what causes that bulge, and one specific type is genuinely dangerous. Botulism specifically thrives in the low-oxygen environment inside a sealed can, and it's one of the few food safety risks that can be fatal. A bulging can isn't a maybe, it's a get-rid-of-it-without-opening-it situation. The same logic applies to jars and sealed pouches. A lid that's already popped up, a pouch that's visibly inflated, or anything leaking from a container that shouldn't be leaking is worth taking seriously rather than explaining away. Small dents on an otherwise flat, properly sealed can are generally fine, worth saying since people sometimes overworry about this part. It's specifically the swelling and leaking that matters, not cosmetic damage to the can itself. Home canned food deserves extra caution beyond anything store-bought. Improperly processed home canning is where most real botulism cases actually originate, which makes proper canning technique, not just the finished jar's appearance, the part that actually matters most. A can that spurts or foams unusually when opened, even without visible bulging beforehand, is worth the same treatment as a swollen one. Trust what happens the moment it's opened over how it looks sitting on the shelf. Any liquid that starts fizzing or bubbling on its own, when it's not supposed to be carbonated, is fermentation happening in real time. Wild yeast or bacteria are consuming sugars in the food and producing gas as a byproduct. Juice, broth, and sauces are the most common places this shows up. A jar that hisses or fizzes unexpectedly when opened has almost certainly started fermenting, whether or not anything smells off yet. This one's worth listening for as much as looking for. A faint hiss beyond the normal seal-breaking sound, especially paired with any smell, is the two signs confirming each other rather than one lone false alarm. A completely still, quiet liquid with zero bubbles when opened is the version that's actually reassuring, for what it's worth. Silence is the boring, normal outcome you actually want here. Intentional fermentation, kombucha, homemade pickles, sourdough starter is the obvious exception, since bubbling is literally the process working as designed there. Context is everything. Expected fizz in something meant to ferment is fine. Surprise fizz in something that's supposed to be still is the actual warning. Wine follows a version of this too, worth knowing if it's ever around. Unexpected fizz in a still wine, along with a vinegar-like smell, means it's turned a completely different situation from a sparkling wine doing exactly what it's supposed to. Firm produce turning soft and mushy is the physical sign of cell walls breaking down, driven by both natural enzymes and bacteria working together over time. It's one of the most visually obvious signs on this whole list. Small soft spots on an otherwise firm piece of fruit aren't automatically a discard situation. Cutting around a genuinely isolated bruise is usually fine, the same logic as trimming mold off a hard cheese. Softness spreading through the entire piece is different. That's not one bad spot anymore, it's the whole structure breaking down, and at that point cutting around it doesn't actually solve anything. Root vegetables specifically get a pass on minor softening for longer than people expect. A slightly soft potato or carrot that still smells and looks otherwise normal is often still fine to cook, just past its firmest, freshest window. Sprouting potatoes deserve their own note, since it's a genuinely different signal from softness. Small sprouts trimmed off are usually fine, but a potato that's gone green under the skin or sprouted heavily should just be tossed, since that green tint means a real toxin, not just an aging vegetable. Onions and garlic get soft from the inside out in a way that's easy to miss from the outside. A quick squeeze test catches this before it's obvious visually, since a genuinely soft onion often still looks completely normal under its papery skin. A layer of liquid pooling on top of cottage cheese, sour cream, or yogurt looks alarming, but it's actually one of the more forgivable signs on this list in a lot of cases. Some separation is completely normal, especially in natural or minimally processed dairy, and stirring the liquid back and solves it. That thin, watery layer on its own isn't a reliable spoilage signal. The version worth worrying about is separation that's excessive, paired with any sour smell beyond the product's normal tang, or a texture that's gone grainy rather than just watery on top. Context matters here more than almost anywhere else on this list. A little liquid on a yogurt that's within its window is normal. The same liquid on something weeks past its date, with a smell that's shifted too, is a different situation entirely. Sour cream and creme fraiche follow the same rule as yogurt, and honestly people throw both out too eagerly over a completely normal thin liquid layer. Stir first, smell second, and only worry if something's actually changed beyond that top layer. Some cheeses weep a similar liquid too, particularly softer fresh ones, and the same rule applies there as well. It only becomes a real concern paired with mold, a genuinely sour smell, or a texture that's turned slimy rather than just wet. When everything else looks and smells fine, but something still feels uncertain, a tiny taste, genuinely tiny, is a legitimate last check, not something to avoid entirely. The rule is simple: a small amount on the tip of the tongue, and spit it out immediately if anything registers as sour, bitter, or just wrong. You don't need to swallow to get the information. Your taste buds are picking up the exact same chemical byproducts your nose already checks for, just a second layer of confirmation. If something passed the smell test but fails this one, trust the taste test. This one comes with a real exception worth remembering. Never taste test raw meat, poultry, eggs, or anything that's supposed to be cooked before eating. The risk there isn't spoilage flavor. It's a genuine infection risk that isn't worth a tiny taste to confirm. Cooked leftovers are the fair game category for this test, genuinely. A container of soup or rice sitting a few days that smells fine, but you're still unsure about, is exactly the situation a small, careful taste was built for. Cooked rice specifically deserves a mention here, since it can carry a heat-resistant bacteria that survives cooking and multiplies at room temperature afterward. That's exactly why rice belongs in the fridge within about an hour of cooking, not left out on the counter to cool first. And at number 1, the thing every sign on this list still can't tell you. Some of the most dangerous foodborne bacteria, Salmonella and E. coli specifically, can be present in food that looks, smells, and tastes completely normal. A chicken breast that looks pink and fresh can carry Salmonella. A batch of ground beef with zero off smell can carry E. coli. These pathogens don't produce the sour smells or slimy textures the rest of this list is built around detecting. This is exactly why proper cooking temperatures matter regardless of how fresh something looks. A meat thermometer isn't a backup step for food that seems questionable. It's doing a job your senses genuinely cannot do on their own. Cross-contamination is worth naming directly here too, since it's how a lot of this actually spreads in a normal kitchen. A cutting board used for raw chicken and then, without washing, used for a salad can transfer bacteria that neither food shows any sign of carrying. Safe handling matters the same way. Washing hands, keeping raw meat separate from anything eaten raw, and refrigerating leftovers promptly all protect against risks that never show up as a smell, a color, or a texture change at all. Fridge temperature is the other quiet variable most people never actually check. Bacteria multiply dramatically faster above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a fridge running a few degrees warm than it should be can turn a normally safe week of storage into a much shorter one, invisibly. A cheap appliance thermometer sitting on a middle shelf, checked every so often, catches this before it becomes a problem. Most fridge dials are a rough estimate at best, and the door itself often runs warmer than the shelves further back. Worth knowing for anything genuinely perishable. The 2-hour rule is worth knowing alongside all of this too. Perishable food left at room temperature for more than about 2 hours, or 1 hour in genuinely hot weather, moves into risk territory regardless of how it looks or smells afterward. So that's the list. 10 real signs worth trusting over a date on a package. And one honest reminder that senses alone were never meant to catch everything. None of this is about being afraid of your own fridge. It's about actually using the signs that work, smell, texture, mold, the swollen, can, instead of defaulting to a printed date that was never designed to be the final word in the first place. Getting comfortable with this stuff genuinely takes some practice, and that's normal. The first few times using smell and texture over a date can feel uncertain, and that uncertainty fades fast once a few of these signs get used a handful of times and actually prove reliable. A working fridge kept cold, food stored the right way, and leftovers eaten within a few days does more to prevent real spoilage than checking any single sign after the fact. Prevention is quietly doing most of the work here. A small habit worth building. Label leftovers with the date they went in the fridge, right when you put them away. It removes the guesswork entirely later, and it's the one step that makes every other sign on this list easier to actually use with confidence. When in doubt, and this is the honest last word on all of it, the cost of throwing out one questionable item is almost always smaller than the cost of being wrong about it. Trust the signs, but let uncertainty tip the decision toward caution rather than convenience. If this helps you waste less and worry less at the same time, hit subscribe. New pantry and grocery smart videos almost every day. Tell me in the comments, which one of these 10 did you not know about? Stay stocked, stay smart, and I'll see you in the next one.